You're listening to 3rd Wave Trade Talks, a podcast that explores the dynamic world of global trade and compliance. I'm Grant Sernick, Head of Sales and Marketing at 3rd Wave, where we empower businesses to master the complexities of international trade. Join me as I sit down with industry experts, innovators, and thought leaders to explore the trends, challenges, and insights that shape the future of global trade. All right, we are live with episode number 1 of 3rd Wave Trade Talks. My name is Grant Sernick, and I am the head of sales and marketing for 3rd Wave. And while this is our first official podcast, I've been doing these sessions sort of on Zoom with different players in the international trade and transportation, trade compliance space for a number of years now. And I'm really excited for today's discussion because today we have 3rd Wave CTO Josh Blinick with us. And we're going to jump into this discussion pretty quickly, but Josh has been our CTO for the better part of 15 years and has a great wealth of experience in international trade and transportation, specifically as it deals with importers and shippers. And so without further ado, let me welcome Josh Blinick to 3rd Wave Trade Talks. Josh, welcome.
Thank you very much, Grant.
So let's get into it. Josh, I'm wondering, can you give us, for those that are listening, just a little bit of a background on how it is that you came to be working at 3rd Wave and what the challenge, certainly at the start, what your challenge was and what your mission, your marching orders were right at the start.
I joined the company 2007, around there. My background prior had not been in the sort of enterprise application space, but more in the web development, which when I was graduating from computer science was sort of really picking up steam. So I'd done a lot of stuff in that area, and 3rd Wave had existed for probably, I guess, close to 20 years before that. But had been a very different kind of product. It was more of a bespoke enterprise solution for importers, and the founders were relatively non-technical and had been using a more obscure development language, and it was an incredibly productive environment, and it allowed them to build really complex, intricate applications for our customers that had a lot of custom functionality for each customer. And so around 2007, the web was, picking up steam. Businesses were migrating to the web. There was some early talk about cloud as well. And in fact, 2007 is the year that Chrome became a browser. So just to see how much has changed in, I guess, the last 15 years or so. And when I joined, the goal was to sort of re-platform the application in a modern web environment. And at the time, there was really no skill set for the web at the company. And so the first go at things was to sort of make a hybrid environment using the older technology on the back end and then pure browser on the front end.
And so, just to go back in the time tunnel a little bit, as you mentioned, 2007, looked like the internet was a thing that was here to stay. Technology was changing at the time, what seemed like incredibly rapidly. As you mentioned, Chrome didn't exist, and then it did exist, and I think, if I recall correctly, Google came out with Chrome because at the time the web browsers that existed just weren't pushing technology fast enough, and Google saw what the future likely held, except it had to advance the state of the art of web browsers to a certain point. Is that about right?
Correct. The dominant browser at the time was Internet Explorer by Microsoft, and Firefox had some non-insignificant but pretty small share, and they were very different browsers. They had their own JavaScript, which is the sort of language of the internet. They had their own implementations, and even the rendering of images or HTML was very different among the browsers. Even the versions of IE had very different implementations, which made sort of development in browsers very challenging. And originally, sort of the HTML language of the web was not designed for these really interactive business experiences or consumer experiences. It was mostly about rendering pages, so they were just very slow. And Google was motivated by getting people basically to spend as much time in browsers as possible, and they did a lot to help standardize the sort of web engines and to push the speed forward dramatically. Every year it was improving by several times.
So when it was time, or the decision was taken to re-platform what was historically 3rd-wave ERP to the web, that sort of was, I guess, was your marching order. And so what challenges did that present as you were sort of trying to get there?
So I would say there was a couple goals with the re-platforming. One was to re-platform. The second was we were talking about already sort of turning our business model from sort of designing custom bespoke solutions to more of a product-based application. And what became clear to me pretty early on, and to us as an organization, was just the scope of what we had built over the prior 20 years was massive. And you can do things a certain way when you're building them for a single customer. But when you are sort of moving to more of a product approach, the challenge of making things sort of infinitely customizable or trying to cover off all the functionality that's possible in each of the areas of the sort of full enterprise supply chain application was just too broad for a company of our size. And so on top of that, we had the technical challenge of using sort of the language that we were using in the back end, which was a proprietary language and was also going through its own migration to the web, and using that to build the back end and interface with web APIs to a front end that was then rendering the application. And it proved to be a challenge to keep sort of the productivity that we had in the pure previous environment in our application going forward. And so after a couple of years on that, we really actually had a big sit down and decided that if we were going to do this, we really had to sort of jump in with both feet to sort of a full modern web architecture and take the time to sort of build up our team that way and go from there.
So maybe just talk a little bit for a couple of seconds around what the evolution of 3rd-wave actually went from and to, because 3rd-wave today is really a different incarnation or a different evolution of the company. And it's probably important for our listeners to understand what were we and where are we today.
Yeah, so interesting. I've always been sort of this big believer of companies having a DNA, and when you look at what a company does and how they interact with the world, you can really see the effects of the imprint of that DNA on all of that they do. And for us, that DNA is the sort of supply chain, the full supply chain. And as I mentioned, we had this sort of realization that for the full enterprise was going to be really too much to start with, and that we made the decision to try and find a sort of a niche that we were going to attack first with our sort of first product. And where we got to early on was going to be automated compliance style filing. And the reason we got there was we looked at sort of what was going on in compliance and saying, companies are using a broker. They've got all of this data that's not typically managed on system, or not managed well, or completely on system. And we looked at what was needed and said, well, we have invoice information, we have full SKU control, we have logistics, transport information. Like we've got all the pieces that are needed to really prepare and control what was needed for compliance. And so we sort of looked at that as a early product that we wanted to build out. And we sort of jettisoned like full accounting, and we still had a purchasing module, but at the beginning it was a lighter purchasing module. We were capturing the data from the ERP as opposed to being the ERP of purchase orders for our customers. And so that was sort of our first product that we went to market with.
So, one of the things that we talk about internally is sort of this idea of digital walls, and how at companies, sort of the ERP represents the digital walls. There's a whole host of things that happens beyond the walls. So, for instance, international transportation is something that happens outside. For 3rd Wave, that was always something that I guess was inside for our customers. That was inside the walls, right? And it might not seem obvious to many people listening as to why automated customs was a first choice. And I was going to say obvious first choice. It wasn't actually particularly obvious, but it made sense to us at the time because the transportation piece was inside the three walls, and the documentation that was floating around, I guess, was there. And so getting to the customs filing, which requires sort of transformation and so on, the hard parts were already accomplished, or at least architecturally were already accomplished. Is that right?
Yeah, and more fundamental even to that is, I would say, this. We'll talk about this, I'm sure, a little later. But the overall approach of 3rd Wave, and whether we were doing compliance or ultimately transportation, because of where we started, everything was built around the SKU and the product, and it's very different than sort of a pure transportation system, or even some compliance systems, where they will look at things as from the entry out, right, or from the container out, and ultimately they're going to have to get to a SKU at some point if they want sort of SKU level visibility. But that's very different than when you're building just a pure supply chain platform that has purchasing and sales and inventory and accounting and transportation. The common denominator in the business is the SKU, and you sort of look at these other things as perspectives around the SKU, as opposed to sort of like trying to fit the SKU into your system when you're looking at it from an output back perspective, and because we had that perspective of full SKU control through a supply chain, it just made a lot of sense to us that we would be in a good position to actually build a system that helped companies with sort of the control that they needed for compliance, right? And a lot of that stuff wasn't captured in an ERP, right? They might have SKU level detail, but being able to interface with sort of government regulatory requirements was not something that was well captured in most companies' ERP systems.
Right. For those that are listening that maybe aren't familiar with customs management and trade compliance, from an import perspective, transforming operational data from an import perspective into a customs entry with doing it in a totally automated fashion without requiring any manual intervention is kind of the holy grail of customs management. And for most companies that have to deal with a customs broker, that becomes a real challenge, sort of that whole management of the process. And 3rdwave has been able to accomplish, that mission that was to develop that first application that was automated customs and enable our customers to completely transform their operational data into a validated customs entry, was a significant milestone, both for us as a company and for our customers. So that was that was pretty significant. And so then beyond the trade compliance or the import trade compliance elements, what then happened from an evolutionary perspective, Josh?
Well, we really, I guess from there, the next area of attack was really transportation, international transportation. And, it became sort of obvious in retrospect just how closely tied the compliance and transportation were in terms of their requirements for data and process. And, we looked at how often compliance groups are either reporting to or working very closely with transportation groups within generally small to mid-sized importers and organizations, and said they need packing lists, and they need visibility into when containers are leaving or air shipments are leaving and arriving, where they're arriving, all of that kind of information. And they are really one or two sides of the same process, really, of importing goods. And so we extended the application to be sort of a two-headed monster, where we had transportation on one side and compliance on the other. But they underneath, or architecturally, it's a one holistic application managing these two related processes.
So, this is maybe a good time to just bring up the concept of visibility, because I think that this is sort of a concept that both is internally been a real focus for us in gaining data visibility for our customers. But from a broader perspective, the industry has largely oriented around the term visibility as a concept that people want. And this has created a whole lot of challenge for us from a sales and marketing perspective, but beyond that, a real challenge, I think, for the market, because visibility has basically gotten confusing. The term visibility has gotten confusing. I'm wondering, you've done a lot of thinking on this as to what visibility really means and where the challenges are. I'm wondering if maybe you want to talk a little bit about why does visibility present confusion within the marketplace?
So I think, when people say visibility, or when the industry says visibility, what they're often talking about is sort of container level visibility and track and trace. And that's become the sort of dominant meaning, certainly on the transportation side. There's sort of more Fortune 100, Fortune 500 supply chain visibility. But when we're talking about transportation, we're talking about often sort of, where's my container? When is it arriving? And that's coincided with the sort of, the greater availability of that information through data feeds from companies like Vision or P44. And that really is what most people, when they speak to us, or when we're looking at what's being talked about, that's what they're talking about. For us, where we've come from, we have taken sort of a different approach to visibility. And whereas the other definition is sort of where's the container, or the unit of transport, we're often looking at visibility that's sort of closer to the definition of supply chain visibility, which is sort of like, it's nice to know where that container is, but really what we're looking at is what does it mean when we say a container is at this point or arriving at this point at a certain time. So the visibility into the context of that data point or that change in data point, and the underlying product that sits within the container, and what that means for the purchase order that's tied to it, or the sales order that's tied to it, and for the different groups within the organization that have an interest in that container getting where it's supposed to be at a certain time, right? And that's another dimension that we look at is sort of the cost visibility, and all of these things that go into making decisions as an importer around a shipment.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest challenge, ultimately, is this idea, or the biggest a summary would be that the challenge is around, as you were saying, that for the industry, the LSP, or the logistics service provider industry, moving containers around, basically, you really do care about where is the container, when will it arrive, how do I plan that container in the movement. But for the beneficial cargo owner, the BCO, or the shipper, they care about, how does where it is or when it will arrive impact the broader implication within the organization, right? As you said, if it's a purchase order, sales order, how does it impact the customer? How does it import our broader organization? And the broader organization cares way more about where product is than where a shipment is at any point in time. And that's a real problem, because the industry, I guess, is oriented, nobody makes a distinction between visibility for a BCO versus visibility for a forwarder, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. And when you look at, when you go to these if you go to the website of most of these visibility providers, they will mention sort of just container visibility or shipment visibility, and they will talk about servicing forwarders, carriers, and BCOs, or shippers, and they don't really make a distinction, or they will make the distinction, but now they're left in the position of trying to satisfy two very, very different markets that have different cost structures and different volumes and really different sets of interests. And if you're a forwarder or an LSP, your business really is sort of high volume, low margin moving of containers, right, or units of transport units. Whereas if you're an importer, your business is about moving product, and one container can have a very different business impact than another container on the same vessel or somewhere else in the world. And so for us, the visibility is about decision support when you have hundreds or potentially even 1,000 or more containers on the go at a given time. Visibility, one way to look at visibility as well, we can give you updates every day of this data point changing or that data point changing, and now you've got thousands of updates potentially daily over a couple of days. And how do you actually make sense of all of this visibility, right? It becomes overwhelming pretty quickly, and really what you're trying to do is understand, well, what do I need to know? What's important? If I've got 8 hours in my day, there's only so many things I can do as an operator. And so what are the things that so the highest value that I need to take care of?
There are a couple ways that we can go here. maybe the first place that I want to just dive a little deeper into the economics and why the economics between a logistics service provider or a freight forwarder, why the distinction between what they care about or what they need to manage and what a BCO needs to manage matters from a business model perspective, and how that impacts sort of ultimately the value that gets created. And I think it really does come down to economics. So maybe do you want to just talk a little bit about sort of why the economics matter?
Sure. So, I mean, you can jump in on here as well, because it has to do a lot more with sales. But if you are a forwarder and you're moving a container across the ocean, let's say, the cost is going to be for the move is a couple $1,000s, maybe it's more, certainly when there's world events happening. But the forwarder share of that is actually relatively small. $100, a little more, a little less, and so they, that's what a container is worth to them, and they're managing thousands and thousands of these containers. And so if you are selling a visibility solution to them, their revenue per container is sort of the upper bounds of you're fighting for a piece of that pie. If you're the importer, your freight spend is significantly higher. You're spending to thousands of dollars on the container, but the real cost to you is the value of the goods in that container, or the potential for value managing that container. And so you can be spending thousands of dollars, but you could have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of goods in that container, and the cost to not managing that container's movement effectively can be extreme. And so if you're looking at selling visibility to one or the other, they really are different markets. And the way that a BCO will see value in having a sort of more advanced, a more white glove solution is different potentially than the way a forwarder would see that.
Well, I guess one way to look at it would be that if, on the LSP forwarder side, it's a low margin, high volume business. On the BCO, it would be a higher margin, lower volume business. And, quite frankly, the business models for those two outcomes aren't necessarily aligned, right? So if you could imagine, if you're a P44, you need to sell lots and lots of containers at, whatever their price is, $2, $3, $4 for a thing. If that's the price you're charging, you need tens or hundreds of thousands of containers that you're moving to make that work. Whereas, the vast majority of importers don't import hundreds of thousands of containers. There are only a handful of 100,000 container importers, right? So now if you have to design product to match sort of where the value is, you're going to focus on value for one or focus on value for the other. And so it really does become difficult for, the visibility providers to serve both masters, right? And that becomes a challenge. So that's one of the things. It took us a little while to figure that one out in the marketplace, I guess. And there are a couple other elements that sort of fall into that same category, I think, as it relates to sort of confusion in the marketplace and what else creates confusion in the marketplace. And aside from just service provider versus BCO or shipper or importer, what other sort of confounding dimensions sort of create challenges for people looking to crack the visibility, understanding on visibility?
And so I'd say there's several dimensions. One of the challenges I would say with the supply chain, building software in the supply chain generally, is that there is a natural push or pull towards expanding the scope of the software, right? And so the supply chain, it involves transportation, involves purchasing, sales, inventory, all these things, right? And the boundaries, sometimes they're explicit and obvious, and sometimes they're not as explicit and obvious. And one of the things that's changed a lot since 2007 is the sort of proliferation of let's say companies that are working together and integrating together to create these sort of software as a service solutions that really play nicely together. But in the past, it was definitely more of a sort of requirement to say, well, if only our software did this. Companies are always, we speak to 100 companies, we get asked to do 100 different things, right? And so the age-old challenge of being able to say no and sort of understand where to draw those boundaries. And I think, one of the challenges when you hear, the big consulting companies report and talk, there's a lot of things that, the difference between what a large sort of Fortune 500 company is asking for and needs for their business, and what, the sort of smaller companies, which are still doing, potentially, $1 billion plus worth of business, 10,000 containers, is still, they're very different. And traditionally, there was a real, it seemed like that, the solutions in the space were very, very expensive, $500,000 a year or more. And it was the big companies who really got to try and take advantage of these, and smaller companies really didn't have a lot of things that were being offered to them, or they were being forced to really, ante up and pay quite a bit of money for them. And so, there's I think if you look at these companies as well, that they don't go and make it clear what's which market they're playing in, or they are going in the Fortune 500 space and thinking that smaller companies will sort of benefit from these potentially over-engineered, over-complex systems. Another area where companies often have internally the requirement of managing the international transportation, as well as the as domestic transportation. And typically what's happened in the industry is companies start in one of these spaces, and then, as I mentioned before, they sort of look and say, oh, the customers need this too, and so we're going to sort of create some sort of offering that handles that as well. So there'll be a domestic transportation company, and then build some sort of international module, right? And in our experience, when you talk to their customers, they end up doing the one that they started with quite well, comprehensively, and not the other. And that goes back to sort of the DNA observation that the company is really, they have their spot, and it's a challenge to grow out of it and do something different, right? And so when companies are buying, often they will be attracted to the solution that says they can do everything, and that can sometimes lead to sort of challenging implementations.
Yeah, and I guess the point here is around international ultimately is fundamentally different than domestic, and it's not obvious that that something that is designed for domestic, if you were looking to manage domestic transportation, which is invariably trucking, TL, LTL, typically not really focused on product and how products are going to work. How do you take that and create an international module where trade compliance and customs is central, and that's predicated on having a sound foundation product and product through the supply chain? right? And so, that becomes a real challenge with the international and domestic. So there were, I guess, just in summary, I wanted to highlight or just sum up sort of the three primary challenges that you indicated, because I think, for somebody listening, it maybe this has been a long conversation, but you have the idea of international versus domestic, which is a problem, and then you have the challenge of LSP or service provider versus BCO importer shipper, right? Which focus you have, and then you mentioned as well the size of company matters, where you have the Fortune 500 companies, let's say, that have a big battle chest and can sort of build their own applications with the scope and dealing with the challenges that they have. But then you have the non-Fortune 5, the small and the mid-sized guys, which, by the way, aren't necessarily small at all. They just don't have the battle chest, where you were saying that, they essentially, they're more meat and potatoes kind of guys or gals, where they really care about the core of just shipping, and some of the other peripheral things become less important to them. And that's a third complicating factor for sort of just not understanding what's there. And one of the challenges, at least I experienced sort of in the marketplace, is that there's a lot of talk and discussion around those things that are really, really focused on those Fortune 500 companies, and that goes around ESG and carbon footprint. Even though carbon now in Europe has become regulated, there are things that just as much as some companies want to be able to manage this stuff, they just don't have the ability, and they're struggling in today's world with just the truly meat and potatoes foundational things that have to happen. So, all right, well, let's switch gears for a sec. So if you were to, we just said there are three different dimensions that matter to us, or that you found are important. Where do third wave as a application and a platform, you or we as a company have had to choose or focus, because we've said these things are important, that we are going to focus on something. Where do we land on these dimensions?
Yeah, so it may be obvious or may not be obvious based on the conversation to this point, but really we focused on working on for the shipper and not the service provider, and doing really international import shipments for companies that are typically in the sort of 1,000 to 20,000 containers a year, or shipments a year, whether they're containers or not, kind of size. And so, a lot of that comes from the sort of the origins of the company. We've always enjoyed working with, we were the original origins of this company were actually importers themselves. And so, we've always enjoyed working with sort of privately owned businesses that do import, that just know their business cold, and they're not messing around. They're not these companies with thousands of employees necessarily. They're lean, and they're highly focused on optimizing their process, and they appreciate having a partner that's going to work with them over many years to sort of streamline the software to meet their requirements. And so that's always been sort of where we sort of enjoy, I think, being, and what sort of gets us excited, working on the product every day, is getting to work with them and show them, the progress, and get the feedback when it ultimately gets into their hands. And so, given our size, and we've had to focus ourselves on narrowing the scope of the software, narrowing, I think, the markets that we want to play in and address. And so we've gone with where we think we offer the best, the best fit, which is this sort of, smaller, but not necessarily small businesses. And stick with importers who, will see the value in what we're doing. We were talking before about the LSP versus the importer, the value, and really, by virtue of doing compliance, and sort of SKU level control of the data, it really does open up a whole bunch of other potential value as well, both for our customer and potentially for us, down the road, by unlocking more value from having that data, really well controlled. So, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that was good. So let's in the short amount of time that we have left, let's maybe switch tracks a little bit to, you've been doing a lot of work on sort of 3rdwave's next evolution of visibility within the application. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of some of the learnings that we've had, and the really, like, I find some of this stuff fascinating because most people don't think about they know they want it, but they don't really know what it is. And I find some of the thinking that you come up with your team to be totally fascinating. So maybe some of the top 3 of things that you've discovered or learned over the last few months would be maybe interesting to our listeners.
Well, I'll start with one, and maybe we'll go from there, from a conversation perspective, because I think sort of one that will hopefully resonate with people who have given some thought to sort of visibility and what's going on. We've, as you mentioned, been spending the last year really on a real sort of like version 2 of our overall transportation shipment execution platform. And typically you're looking at having legs of a shipment, and you're managing sort of estimates and actuals in terms of arrival. And we've given a lot of thought to sort of date control and date understanding to provide ultimately the kind of alerting and dashboarding that our customers want to be able to have. And we've come up with this much sort of more comprehensive concept of sort of what is a date. And so if you were to look
Josh,
at...
if I can interrupt for a sec. So like this is kind of important to note, I guess, at this point, and this really is one of the fundamental differences between managing for a service provider and managing for a BCO. What you haven't stated, I think, is that what everybody's always asking for, what's the ETA? When am I going to see this? When am I going to get this? Right. But for an LSP, when am I going to get this is when am I going to get the container? And for a BCO, when am I going to get this is for a product. For product, when am I going to get this product coming in? Right. And given that those are 2 different things, the detail that needs to be managed for these actually matters quite dramatically. Right.
So there's I mean, this is actually the next layer. But if you actually go back to sort of the let's say pure transportation side, right, where we're not layering in, let's say, required in inventory and these sort of things about the actual product. If you're for the importer who's managing, multiple carriers, multiple forwarders within our platform, they have, let's say, estimated departure, the port of loading, or estimated arrival, and an actual arrival. But one of the big areas we've looked at is sort of the areas of control for our customer. A big part of that is actually before the shipment and after the shipment when it arrives at port, right? And so we have also not just estimated and arrived, but we have the concept of planned estimates, planned arrivals, and then we capture the dates of instruction when they've been instructed and when it's come back confirmed or booked. And so when you're looking at shipments within the 3rd Wave platform, you have what we call a best date of when something is going to depart, but that date can be anything from something that's sort of in a planning stage to something that's been instructed to something that's been booked to something that's been actually estimated, which is we've been given a status update of it's actually physically happening, to an actual date, and then we have on top of it the predicted dates, which are using a variety of techniques and constantly evolving to give, in the absence of actual estimates from a carrier, looking downstream at chains and back, and to get when is this going to actually arrive at a warehouse or at a customer, right? And so, it's amazing how when you start looking at the 5 or 6 different layers of dates on a single point of like arrival at a node or departure from a port, what do these dates mean, and then how do you use these dates within the system to either measure performance or enable alerting when things don't go according to plan. And then, as you mentioned, now we have dates that are not necessarily transportation dates, but they're sort of business reference dates, either attached to a purchase order or a sales order, that now get connected through the SKU automatically. And then, we can use all of those different dates to say, well, this ETD got bumped over, in India, and we have a required by date now in at the warehouse that, based on a prediction algorithm, is going to now create a problem, right? And so that can go up on a dashboard or an alert, and you get this real interaction between the plan dates, the actual execution dates, and these business dates that all sort of connect to each other, right? And then there's all sorts of little sort of idiosyncrasies that as we've gone about building this, you quickly encounter, what you do when, it's great when you have dates, let's say from the carrier updates, but what do you do when, some of these dates are less reliable or certain carriers don't provide updates, and you still want the system to perform. And that, one of the goals we realized is, when our users are looking at data, the data has to be reliable. Otherwise it won't be trusted, right? And if it's not reliable, at some very high threshold at the time, then they just won't rely on the data at all at any time, because how can they?
Right. So, one of the major concepts that I think pervades a lot of your thinking, and is really important to our customers is, and this comes to visibility and what visibility sort of implies, but is the idea that they're not passive observers on this ship, so to speak. They have a requirement to be active and make decisions depending on what's happening on the ground as it relates to their shipments. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that point as it relates to our customers.
Yeah. So, we spent a lot of time, now that we've, been doing this for several years on the transportation side, really looking at the kinds of activities that our customers do. And, we've had to, we really sit down with them, because sometimes it's not obvious, because they'll just go off system to do some function without asking. Sometimes they ask, often. But what we really realized is if there's often stuff happening before the shipment. I would call it like sort of pre-transit shipment planning. That is the area where they can most sort of affect what's happening, right? Decisions they make before a shipment gets booked or executed is a huge step where activity happens. Obviously, once something is in movement with a carrier, 3 weeks on a boat, there's not a lot that can be done to affect change in most circumstances, or on a plane. But when it gets to port, depending on the terms, if the customer is ordering drayage themselves, there's a lot of decisions that can be made, especially with congestion at the port or congestion at the destination, in terms of prioritizing how drayage gets planned, executed, and so we spent a lot of time, just breaking down what these activities are, what's needed to support those activities, and taking sort of that low level visibility and turning it into sort of contextualized information that can be used to really sort of control the process, so more actively.
All right. We're almost out of time here. And so, and we're sitting here at the beginning of 2024. The single biggest sort of trend, I think, is related to AI. And I would be remiss not to ask you, what do you think the future holds as it relates to AI? How, there are certain elements that AI is going to be transformational with almost certainly in the short term, and then the question is what longer term. What are your thoughts on AI, and how what are we going to see in the next 2-3 years as it relates to AI and a meaningful impact on supply chains?
So that's a hard question to answer, probably. I've unlike blockchain, which I was relatively negative on for this supply chain space, or let's say skeptical. To me, there's sort of no question that AI is real and the value is real, and it's going to transform pretty much every industry in ways that we really are only beginning to understand. And sort of as CTO, I'm looking at it from the supply chain perspective, and I'm also looking at it on the development side. And particularly on the development side, it's already doing things that like a year ago would have been harder for me to imagine. And so I think there's a lot of talk about generative AI when it comes to document reading and contextualization, which is a huge problem. Obviously, in the industry that still is dealing with a lot of PDF, Excel outputs, and getting those things digitized accurately is really crucial. It's something that we at 3rd Wave have relied on is good, accurate, contextualized data. And so I think from a sort of low-hanging fruit, you see a number of companies already doing things in the space. And I would expect that the progress is going to be quite quick. What will be interesting is I see the progress on AI is just incredibly rapid, and traditionally the ability of companies to adopt technology has not been rapid. And so, the challenge for people in the sort of tasked with making these sort of technical roadmap decisions for our customers and for software companies is how do you sort of almost keep up with the advancements and try and stay, 1 or 2 steps ahead of what's going on. But it's, I think from our perspective and where 3rd Wave sits, what should happen is that companies are realizing that their data is more valuable. Having better data and more data is a greater advantage in an AI world. And so, hopefully there's going to be a premium on software that can sort of wrangle this data and help get it contextualized within an environment that can then be leveraged by the different AI offerings that are available.
All right. Well, I think that's probably a pretty good place to end it. Do you have any last comments that you want to make? Where can people find you, Josh?
Well, easiest place is on LinkedIn. It's where we sit. It's we're a relatively opinionated software company in terms of our ideas and thought. We do a lot of thinking, a lot of talking internally about the industry, about data, about sort of customer needs. And we relaunched our website a month or two ago after quite a bit of thought and thinking, and we put a lot of that thinking on the website. So I would encourage people to check out 3rdwave.co. And we have a whole blueprint section, which sort of discusses sort of more fundamentally, philosophically, things that are happening in the supply chain rather than specifics to a particular product. And so, that's where you can find it.
All right. Right on. And so let me thank you for doing this, Josh, and to our listeners. As Josh mentioned, please go to 3rdwave.co. Please follow us on LinkedIn. We're 3RDWAVE. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of 3rdwave Trade Talks. So again, thanks for your time today, and we look forward to chatting with you soon. Thanks for listening to 3rdwave Trade Talks. To get in touch and learn more about what we do, visit our website at 3rdwave.co. There you'll find more resources to enrich your knowledge of global trade. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time.